Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Aaron Blade, and I am the editor, creator, and producer of what you're watching right now, Blade Talk. If you are new here, welcome, and you find this presentation helpful, informative, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. Do me an even greater favor and subscribe to my channel. I always appreciate all the support that I am given. So today, I'm going to tackle the controversial topic in Judaism. Is Orthodoxy, the Orthodox movement, the only legitimate and authentic way to practice Judaism? I've seen many comments and I've gotten a few emails about this question. Is Orthodoxy the only legitimate way to be Jewish? Let's find out. Let's hit that intro and let's begin. Okay, so is Orthodox Judaism the only legitimate way to practice Judaism? I always like to ask the question, what exactly makes any sect or religion, of any religion, the only legitimate way to practice it? For example, the Catholics believe that the first legitimate way to practice Christianity was Catholicism. However, Eastern Orthodox, various Protestant denominations, Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, all lay claim to that title as being the only legitimate way to practice Christianity. The same could be said in Islam with the Sunni and Shia Muslims. So what makes any particular sect or denomination of any religion the only legitimate way to practice it? I would argue that Judaism is no different. The various forms of orthodoxy claim to be the only legitimate forms of Judaism because their adherents put a higher emphasis on halakha or Jewish law than Reform, conservative, etc. Generally speaking, the Orthodox movement does not recognize other movements for this reason. But let's make a few points here. What specifically makes Orthodoxy the legitimate form of Judaism in the first place? And in fact, Orthodox Judaism, in the modern sense, has very little resemblance to the religion practiced by the ancient Israelites in the era of the First Temple. You see, that religion was a religion replete with high priests, animal sacrifices, religious pilgrimages, etc. In fact, the modern form of Judaism, i.e., with rabbis, the Talmud, etc., really came about in exile after the destruction of the First Temple. In a sense, Rabbinic Judaism democratized the religion by taking the power away from the priesthood and giving the power to educated laymen who devoted their lives to studying the religion, i.e., rabbis. In other words, Judaism reformed based on the fact that the form of Judaism they used to practice was not relevant in exile. Why then are people not making the argument that the only legitimate form of Judaism is one based around the ancient priesthood or animal sacrifices? It has to do with a large sectarian battle about 2,000 years ago. When the Jews returned to Jerusalem in the Second Temple era, the practitioners of the rabbinic branch of Judaism belonged to a sect called the Pharisees. And the Pharisees saw a lot of opposition from other sects, especially the Sadducees, who favored a return to the former power structure with a priesthood. In fact, the conflict between the Pharisees and the Sadducees played a large part on how Romans were able to conquer Judah in the first place. You see, as the Pharisees supported Roman rule over the ruling Hasmonean dynasty, they essentially opened the doors to them. The Hasmonean dynasty favored the Sadducees. During early Jewish exile after the expulsion from Rome, there was also a conflict between Rabbinic Judaism and Karaite Judaism, which rejected the legitimacy of the Oral Torah and the Talmud. A small sect of Karaite Jews still exists today, primarily in Israel. After this, the form of Rabbinic Judaism that eventually became the basis for Orthodox Judaism became the dominant form of the religion essentially until the Enlightenment era. Since Jews were often forced to live in segregated communities where they lacked the same political rights as the Christians and Muslims in the societies that they lived in, it was easy for this form of the religion to thrive. In these societies, Jews often lived according to Jewish law, and rabbis served as de facto community judges and political representatives. It was a form of the religion that worked as long as Jews lived in centralized communities and lacked the social and political rights to move beyond those communities. The Haskalah or Jewish Enlightenment era changed this. This was a time in the 18th and 19th centuries when Jews started to become afforded more political rights in a more secularized and increasingly democratic European society. The Reform and later the conservative movements came about as an attempt to reconcile the wants of the greater Jewish community to become a part of the secular society that they lived in while maintaining their religious identity. In other words, the Reform movement basically did what the Rabbinic movement had done several centuries prior. They adapted the religion to the changing socio-political situation of the Jewish people. The Reform movement had a different interpretation of Jewish law than the traditionalists of the day, just as the Rabbinic Jews in Babylon had a different interpretation than those of the Temple era. The rabbis were threatened by the political reforms of the day because it essentially removed their roles as judges and political authorities and made them clergy. The Orthodox movement came about actually as a traditionalist reaction to the reformers, and the conservative movement arose essentially as a compromise between the Reform and Orthodox movements by drawing on concepts from both. When it comes to what lends legitimacy to a particular religious group, why not look at the specific numbers following it? After all, over half of America's Jewish population identifies as Reform or conservative, whereas only 10% identify as Orthodox. The reason Rabbinic Judaism won out over the Sadducees and the Karaites originally was because the numbers of their followers and the socio-political situation of the Jews favored them. In the USA, the numbers and socio-political situation of the Jews favors the Reform and conservative movements. If one is going to define Orthodox Judaism as the only legitimate form of Judaism, then you must necessarily argue that the vast majority of practicing Jews in this country are not legitimate Jews. Adhering to this rigid interpretation of this religion ignores the fact that traditional Rabbinic Judaism was itself a reform movement against the religious power structures of the day, and that Orthodox Judaism arose in response to Reform Judaism, not the other way around. Now I want to tackle another question, and I see this a lot. And that is, why don't Orthodox Jews, more specifically Orthodox rabbis, recognize Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism as valid expressions of Judaism. So I see this question as more about ability rather than will or reason. But taking this question, I'll share why I think Orthodox Judaism is unable to recognize other groups like conservative or reform as valid forms of Judaism. 3 reasons. First, Orthodox Judaism is a description of a category containing many different groups of Jews adhering to differing schools of thoughts. Most importantly, there is no single authoritative person or council that represents the movement. Even the OU, Orthodox Union, does not unify all Orthodox Jews. Certainly the RCA has its detractors, as does the Aguda, Chabad, and all the Haredi sects, let alone all Orthodox Sephardim whose identity and leadership differ. So given the lack of an entity or person to represent the movement as a movement is largely incapable of recognizing anything. The moment one leader or group states a claim about something new, there will be another to disagree. At best, you can get many Orthodox people to agree on something, but others within the movement will almost certainly disagree and challenge the authority of those who stated the first claim. Even Maimonides' 13 Principles, which serves as a pretty good litmus test, are not universally accepted among Orthodoxy as a standard. They were contested both by those who suggested formulas with fewer principles and those who rejected the reductionism to anything less than 613 laws. My second reason is kind of related to the first. Orthodoxy, both in its genesis as a resistance to the Reformation and certainly in its current sociology, is a movement whose identity is largely based on what it rejects, not what it embraces. A common theme among members of this movement is the identification of things to reject, whether that be the authorities, new trends, opposition to new trends, and most certainly any other school of thought within Judaism. So the idea of Orthodox Judaism as a whole is built on what it rejects, not what it embraces. My third reason is to many Orthodox, the other movements represent an existential threat to the entire chain of history that connects a divine covenant some 3,500 years ago to a divine promise of a messianic salvation in the future. There is a paralyzing fear that if one warms up to the notion that the other movements have some validity, that one day their child or grandchild will identify themselves with that movement, and in 1 or 2 generations, they will be lost forever. The fear of social extinction is strong among Orthodox Jews. They draw a direct line between the Reformation's attempt to normalize Jews within German Gentile society to the extermination of millions of Jews by German Gentiles and their sympathizers, and to the assimilation of Jews within Western culture such that their identity is eroded. In a sense, they blame the Reformation for setting the stage for both physical as well as spiritual extermination. So just to recap, the first reason that I mentioned Orthodoxy can't consider other movements as valid is because they lack the ability for the movement to agree on any assertion due to its lack of a unifying authority. My second reason is the tendency of the movement to define identity based on its ability to reject that which it is not. My third reason is the fear that the acceptance of the other movements as equals will initiate self destruction. The Orthodox movement is unable to, as a movement, proclaim that other movements are as valid as they are. Such a proclamation cannot hold beyond the opinion of a few brave leaders who will then invite far more accusations than cheer. The elusive declaration of validity simply cannot happen, even if many individuals wished it to. A few things to note. Orthodox Jews tend to be very focused on halakhic reality. Should a minyan be formed with a quorum of 10 men, some of whom are members of or even leaders of the conservative or reform movements, the Orthodox participants will proceed as there is a minyan and, for example, respond to a barachu call. Of course, most will not do so if the minyan does not contain the minimal halakhic minyan quorum. This means, whereas they do reject the theology of these other movements, they don't reject the status of the members of these movements as being Jews. Note this is an important point, but it falls down the moment you introduce the issue of conversion. Also, I know many conservative and reformed Jews, but do not know many who care as to whether Orthodox Jews validate their beliefs or not. Certainly, when it comes to the Reform movement, it should be apparent that the movement was a reformation of Judaism, an establishment of a new approach toward the religion, based on an explicit rejection of those called Orthodox. It would be unlikely for those who did not follow their revolution to later endorse it as being valid while still maintaining what the revolution rejected. It is equally unlikely for the revolutionists to seek validity from the very movement they revolted against. This assumes a pluralism that may be found within liberal-minded people, but not within the founders and establishment maintainers of the movements themselves. Whereas movements can reject movements, people don't have to reject people. Movements are conceptual, sociological constructs that represent schools of thought and approaches towards an ideal. People, however, are people. All people are valid. You can't expect people to agree to all ideas. You should expect people to treat others with respect. So, of course, I reject the idea that Orthodox Judaism is the only valid expression and the most authentic or legitimate form of Judaism. It would make no sense. And the reason that they can't accept Reform, conservative, or any other form of Judaism as valid is because that would be like hitting a self-destruct button. The Orthodox movement has always feared modernity. It's always feared secular society, when in actuality, it's an ideology. And I've always warned people about assuming an ideology as your identity. There will always be people who believe one extreme or the other. You'll always have fanatics. And then you'll always have people like myself who are independent thinkers, who are free to think. There's some good on both sides of the aisle. But understand that the Orthodox movement is based on what it rejects, not so much what it embraces. And it itself, the whole Rabbinic Judaism as a whole itself was a reform. It was a reform way of being Jewish. The Sadducees wanted to go back to the old way of doing things. And the Pharisees, as some people believe, I know Rabbi Tovia Singer states that Orthodoxy and Orthodox Jews are just the same as the Pharisees back then, as if it's some kind of badge of honor. Well, the Pharisees were responsible for the Romans overtaking Judah and kicking us out and destroying our temple. So make sure you tell the whole story. On the other hand, without the Pharisees, you wouldn't have Judaism today. But the only reason that you have Judaism today is because it reformed. It evolved. It changed and it adapted to the times that we were living in. And some people don't want to let that go. Consider, again, the status of women. Orthodox Jews, the Orthodox movement as a whole, there is open Orthodoxy, which started ordaining female rabbis. But as I stated, it trips over itself trying to be more backwards and more primitive, because they have the idea that the more primitive you are, the more religious you are. But the status of women changed. And you have to ask yourself, Orthodoxy as a whole doesn't ordain female rabbis. Why? And how much of that decision was influenced by the environment? You see, Jews lived in Christian and Muslim territories. And in Christianity and in Islam, the treatment of women back then was property. So how much of that influenced Judaism or Orthodox Judaism? And now they just made it into this law or tradition. Because in Islam, a woman can't be a leader or an imam. In Christianity, you have Protestant religions, denominations now that adhere to women being called to leadership. But back then, the role of women in Christianity was very minimal. And it exists today even in the Catholic religion. Women can't be priests. Women can't be a pope or a cardinal. And as Jews, we lived in that environment. How much of that affected the Orthodox view of women? And is it valid today? As again, there is no halakhic reason, none, that states that a woman can't be a teacher, can't be a rabbi. But because Orthodoxy is trying to freeze time, they want to freeze a time when women were looked at as property. So no, I don't see Orthodoxy as the only legitimate way to be Jewish. And in many ways, this idea that Orthodoxy is all united is completely false. In the 1950s, Orthodox rabbis tried to reach across the aisle to conservative rabbis. But Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox, stopped it. Again, in the 1980s, a modern Orthodox rabbi tried to reach across the aisle to conservative and reform rabbis. Once again, Haredi stopped it. So it eats itself. There are some Orthodox Jews that believe that you can use electricity on Shabbat. But for every new innovation, every new trend, anything new, they fear it. And when times make people feel insecure, they try to go back to the old way of doing things. The issue is that's impossible. Once you see modernity, you can't unsee it. You can't go home again. You have to adapt. And that's ironically what produced the Orthodox Jews that we have today. It was based on a reform that happened when we were in exile. We had to adapt. So no, Orthodoxy isn't the only legitimate way to be Jewish, to express your Jewishness. And it's not united at all. It trips over itself. My hope is that you express your Judaism and you connect with Hashem and you submerge yourself in the Torah. But my hope is also that when times change, you look at that change through the lens of the Torah and you make a decision. And that decision, my hope, comes from a place of reason, not fear. So, if you found this presentation helpful, informative, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. Do me an even greater favor and subscribe to my channel. I always appreciate all the support that I am given. Thank you all so much for tuning into Blade Talk. Be good to yourselves, be good to others, and until the next presentation, you all take care.